Drafting a Guillotine League with the Overtime listeners. That's what we're doing today on RotoViz Overtime. We're over on guillotineleagues.com. We are drafting against there's 17 of us in the room, Shawn. We have you and me against each other for what I believe is the first time ever. We'll get to the bottom of that as the draft goes on. Shawn did get the 103 and has gone ahead and taken Breece Hall. I have the 111, so sometime before we get to my pick. Shawn, we are drafting against a group of RotoViz Overtime listeners. The way this is set up, we have 17 names in the draft here. Shawn tells me that 18 would have been more precise. I set it up for 17 people, and ideally we would have had one more to make it an extra week, but we'll have a lot of fun, Shawn, nonetheless doing it. We are going to do some more of these potentially through the season. You can't set up this format at any point. It's kind of, last man standing, knock out one team per week as you go through. And one of the awesome things about it is when that team gets eliminated, all their players go into the waiver pool. So that is a lot of fun. Shawn, I'll be coming up to pick in a moment, but before we get to that, how excited are you for this draft?
Excited. I mean, this is a fantastic format. As you mentioned, you can set it up this week, next week, 4 weeks in when you want a rest of season draft. But I also love the format with the weakest teams getting cut, their players going back into the waiver pool. Colm, I put together a big piece about it on RotoViz. You can check that out. The entire piece is free. This is a fun format to work through the various strategic elements, and there are tensions between building yourself for the present and trying to get through those early weeks and saving enough of your free agent budget to last the entire way. I think anytime that you have to make those difficult choices and you have to work through what the consequences would be, I love that. Love it in fantasy football. Love it in other games as well.
Yeah, so you did get a kickoff with a Breece Hall pick, Shawn. I'm at the 111 here, and it is a challenge, and it's going to be even harder for people. Like when we get into the second round, you're with 17 names, it obviously stretches it out quite a bit. But even we get down to 11, it makes it a little bit tricky. I'm kind of hoping here that Jamar Chase lasts one more pick. If he does, I was really hoping that Garrett Wilson might have got to me, but that wasn't the case. But the format, as we'll talk through going through the draft, is going to be a lot of fun. We'll kind of talk through some of the strategic elements of it. So I am now on the clock. We have a situation where kind of none of my prime targets have made it all the way through to me. One of the players we talked about, Shawn, that I haven't drafted a lot of this offseason so far is Marvin Harrison, but I'm going to skip on down past and I'm going to go and get myself some more Chris Olave. You can never have too much Chris Olave is what I believe at this particular point of the offseason. There will be a lot of elements to this. Obviously, if you're picking at the 101, you're going to be picking at pick 34 in the second round. It basically is adding an additional round onto it. So the teams will get thinner as we move through. Shawn might touch on some of the stuff that is in his article looking at it. This is a PPR format, non-tight end premium, non-superflex. I just think I think that people, if they didn't get a chance to listen to me, you and Ben talk about it a couple of seasons back when we got to do a draft that Griffin set up for charity, I would highly recommend giving it a go. You mentioned in your article that it should become the standard home league format. The reason that it is so fun is kind of that each week has a swing one team goes. You kind of just have to make sure you are not the worst team of the entire week every week. But as that goes along, that gets much, much more challenging. And then you obviously have the situation with the waivers and trying to decide, do you spend up big at the start? Do you try and hold some of those dollars towards the end? How do you want to play it? So we might touch on those strategies as we go along too, Shawn, but it is 1 quarterback, 2 running back, 2 wide receiver, 1 tight end, and 2 flex. You probably don't want to give away too much here to me when I'm drafting, ahead of your next pick, but when we look at it in terms of the scoring settings, I mentioned in the 1 point for a reception, a lot of pretty much standard PPR scoring across the board with 4 points per passing touchdown. Anything though in terms of what we be talking about in general that stands out to you in this format as an edge that people may not be focusing on?
I think that you want to wait at the QB position. That's unlikely to be a huge differentiator. If you use an early pick at QB, then in these deep leagues like this, you're going to end up having a harder time filling that lineup across the 2 running back, 2 wide receiver, 2 flex starting lineup. You're going to have a hard time filling that for the first couple of weeks. You don't want to risk being chopped early if there are easy things you can do to avoid it. We want to get through there. The other thing that Ben and I were interested in and didn't quite manage was this element of playing a little bit of chicken, trying to get the last elite tight end. If you don't get that, then wait a bit, maybe build in some additional redundancy at running back or wide receiver if you can stash players who will be important later. I think that this is an interesting format because it is so deep. We are going to get, weaker players starting in, week 1, week 2, week 3, even with the early cuts. Not every team is going to be able to get in there and replenish their rosters or build out their rosters such that they've got a good starting lineup, even in the early going. And yet at the same time, I think that there is a risk of playing it too conservatively once you get out of the high leverage rounds and merely adding in players who, if you're putting them into your roster, you're going to be risking getting cut, getting chopped anyway, right? So that's the thing that you're looking at there. Where can I manage the tiers? The tier-based drafting is arguably even more important in a very deep league like this than it would otherwise be.
Yeah, so it is interesting too. You mentioned some of the elements of like waiting on quarterback, potentially waiting on tight end, which based on me being 2 selections away, I will have a wide receiver option now. Now that Kyron Williams has gone off the board, but when we look through tight end, for example, and the likes of Sam Laporta, Trey McBride, the other side of that with the elite quarterbacks too is you can kind of almost hope that your team is strong enough to continue to make it through and that one of those teams gets chopped, and then you can use that waiver budget as well to strengthen that position. So there's lots of fun elements to look at. I'm 1 pick away, Shawn. You're a long way away when you see the queue here of 17 teams. I'm waiting to see. It's Malik Neighbors or Devontae Smith for me here, Shawn. What I think I'll do each time, I'll name my players. I'll get Shawn's opinion and then we'll make a selection. I want to clarify though, I believe, Shawn, this is the first time that we've ever competed against each other in the same draft. Certainly the first time we've ever recorded a podcast while doing it. Actually, it's not the first time we competed because we accidentally drafted against each other a couple of weeks ago in the Superflex format. So yeah.
And how did that draft go for you there? Did you feel like I was taking any of your guys? It was my fault. I signed up for a draft that Colm and Connor O'Driscoll were streaming. So that was unfortunate. But we ended up with 2 very different and I think compelling teams.
Yeah, 2 different and 2 very interesting teams. Ideally, both of us will come out of that hub, but realistically, that is going to be a challenge. 2 out of the 12 making it through in that. I think the team came out pretty fun in that, but there was a couple of times where we were trying to make our decisions. And this is the same, Shawn, whether it's obviously drafting against yourself or, there's a drafter in this particular draft that I reached out to when we were setting it up. They reached out to see about jumping into this league, but I was drafting 2 days ago in the Superflex format. And, I could, you see the username pop up and I'm like, well, I'm competing here, but I tried to stay on the down low and not say anything until the draft was over because you don't want to get spotted, I think, in those rooms. Try and stay as undercover as possible. But when you're drafting against somebody who's a RotoViz, subscriber or listener, you're always having that little bit of a battle where you're trying to guess who the player is going to take or who might get back around the turn, or if you have a target that you're maybe a round ahead of ADP on, that maybe you need to take them at that particular point rather than risk it going through. So I think both of those teams come out with a good challenge, and I like those drafts when they are challenging. For people listening to this, if you haven't heard as well, myself and Shawn and Blair Andrews did 2 3-man drafts simultaneously on the FFPC Best Ball Tournament that came out on Wednesday. So I'd recommend check that out. 2 fun teams we built. Shawn, you are 2 picks away now. Who are some of the names that you're looking to add to this Breece Hall lineup?
I couldn't avoid the Breece Hall siren song there at the 103. It really should be a receiver in this because we're going to pivot back to some receiver options later. At this point, we're all the way down to the Brandon Ayuk, Mike Evans, Devontae Smith, DJ Moore range. Travis Etienne goes right there. None of the tight ends have gone yet. That was something that I discussed a bit. And, we just mentioned is that you want to hit the end of that tier, not the beginning. I think I've got to go and grab. I'm going to grab some Devontae Smith.
Okay, you go Devontae Smith. I thought you were going to say you were going to have to. Sometimes when we're doing the podcast and you're talking it through, you might make a point one way or the other, and then you're like, well, Sam Laporta really stands out here as an excellent pick at this point. But yeah, I do think trying to wait it through. But the problem is when you're trying to judge these rounds, Shawn, in a 12-team league can be challenging. But when you're in that 17-team element, and as I mentioned at the start, ideally you would have 18 teams in this for week 1, 17 weeks if you're doing it in week 2. That would lead to, the last knockout spot for 2 people would end up being in the fantasy football final. So this will end up probably ending 1 week early based on being 1 team short. But additionally, if you were trying to do this in, week 9 or week 10, you can set it up with a smaller group. And we, as I mentioned, will hopefully do some of these throughout the season. You can kind of set it up any week that you want to do it. So that is a fun aspect to it. And just to prove
if you, didn't get your work league together in time, which is something that happens to all of us. I mean, you have Labor Day weekend last weekend. You have the start of school for people with kids. I mean, just everything is happening at once. You think you've got the league set. It doesn't happen. You can start it in week 2. You can start it in week 3. Obviously, once you get that rest of season itch, you can start it then. But Colm, one of the things I love about this sort of progressive element is that you can set up the prize pool with different levels for, making it to 14, 15, 16, 17. You can set up different penalties where participants have to contribute more to charity for each week that they don't make it. So you get chopped out of week 1 and, maybe depending on your circumstances, if you're in with a bunch of high rollers at your job there, $500 to the charity if you're the first team that gets chopped. Whatever level is appropriate, you can do all of that. I think so much fun there. Colm, I'm trying to figure out how far I want to drop down here. I'm going to go ahead and take.
It's going to be wide. Oh my goodness. My goodness. Xavier Worthy, Shawn, 3rd pick here. You add him to Devontae Smith, Breece Hall. Was there other names? I'm sure there was. I'm sure it's just a case of this is going to be Shawn's most fun draft. Just get all the guys. Xavier Worthy. Yeah. You weren't going to let him come back to me, no? I have enough. I don't need any more.
People are going to have to get their guys if they want them in this draft.
Yeah, I'm hoping now at this point, to get it back and get another strong receiver at this point. When you obviously did one of these with Ben over the last week, we talk about wide receiver cliffs, but the sheer drop off here as you work your way through and try and build out the roster, things will thin up quite considerably at the end of this, which makes it a fun challenge as well, and get into some of those deeper players. But yeah, that's a nice early spot there for Xavier Worthy. And I don't think
now you're a little panicked about who's going to get back to you, aren't you?
Well, I'm looking here at Zay Flowers and T. Higgins, but it is going to be a case, Shawn, if Brandon Ayuk doesn't get drafted in these next few picks, he will have to be added to this roster as well. So these are famous last words, I'm quite confident one of those 3 names will get to me. The first tight end did go in Sam Laporta. The other tight ends there, we are kind of trying to push it as far as we can, but Mark Andrews goes off the board. So yeah, I'm going to get one of those guys. I'm pretty confident. So I'd be happy with those as the wide receiver 3 on this particular team. But now that I say that, I'm sure they all will fastly disappear. Waiting on quarterback, Shawn. In this format, we have 2 quarterbacks gone. We have Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, one in the 2nd round, one at the 301. I think it's like when you get into these, if you want to go to the end of the elite tier, I know in the FFPC main event that we took CJ Stroud. If you want to kind of push it a little bit like the quarterback position and do that, I think it's fine. But I really do think that, adding your position allocations elsewhere and then trying to get a quarterback late on, even in the streaming options, because as I mentioned, teams getting cut and you can go back in and get the QB. The one thing that you do have to factor in, though, is we talked about Josh Allen a little bit on a recent show, and kind of the fear of not drafting him and the potential for him to kind of go supernova this season. So if you look into that and factor that in, there is that part in that week to week where you could fall away behind, but I think that's much less concerning for me when you have 17 teams that then cuts to 16, that then cuts to 15. Like Josh Allen might make that team have the highest score in total of the week, but that's not really for me going to be the difference maker to you not making it through until you get to those final 6-7 teams, where those teams then will have added elite quarterbacks through waivers and so on.
Well, the interesting part, I think that there is some value to taking the elite quarterback to getting through. I was saying that maybe won't be the differentiator early if you end up then having to play 1 or 2 weak spots in your week 1 lineup. But, we could get such a gap from the elite quarterbacks that even if you have that, it just balances out, you're fine. You like to have the type of floor that mostly we have gotten from a Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts. One of the problems, though, is that as you move through the draft, the QB doesn't separate because so many of the teams end up with 1, if not 2 elite QBs. And even in free agency, they are not expensive to go after. Now, every league may be a little bit different. You may have a situation, especially in a deep league, where you do get blocked a few times, and yet it's so critically important to land the players who are going to help you get through and who are going to cost you, right? Those types of players, so you're able to manage your bidding in the middle weeks. The teams that advance and also maintain a large free agent budget are going to have so much flexibility when you get down to the final 4, the final 5, and teams are being cut that not only have all of their original players, but they have all of their free agent pickups. And then those guys go back in. So sometimes you'll see this same name, like a Josh Allen will appear in the pool 2 or 3 times. And
then other people may also not have budget allocation left at that point. Depending on if you spend your money or keep your money, you may have an easy win to add that quarterback to your roster.
Right. And it's not just that, though. You may have the money necessary to cover a couple of different teams on a couple of guys.
Yeah.
If you're in a situation where in a week, somewhat late in the season, that you can add the players who were essentially like the 103 and the 104, and you already had a team with a bunch of first round picks, it's not that you couldn't still lose, but it puts you in a very, very strong position to be that last person standing.
Yeah, so it's a lot of elements, and I hope that when people are listening, they kind of think that it is an enjoyable format, not just something that we're saying is enjoyable. I really do have a good time with it. We have seen the tight end, though, Shawn, start to move in the draft. We have Sam Laporta, Mark Andrews, Dalton Kincaid, Trey McBride, Travis Kelce, all going off the board, with Kincaid, McBride, and Kelce going off in the last 5 picks in the end of the 3rd round. I do think that part of that is also down to the position at wide receiver maybe becoming a little bit flat. So I think that people are pivoting then to where there's, maybe a tier in terms of strength at that tight end position.
I reached down below all of these guys.
You and all
wide receiver selection. Not
the one thing I have to say, Shawn, is that wide receiver wouldn't have got back to you. So, you had to reach. Looking at the names, Lamar Jackson was the next selection, but Keenan Allen, Jaden Reed, some of the wide receivers that are in this kind of area. You're looking down then to Roma Dunze, JSN, Brian Thomas. So there is wide receivers, but a little bit like Shawn mentioned, you are moving down to get which one of those particular names you want to pick out of it. So I can see why people are moving down. Looking at the top of the ADP queue, George Pickens, Pittman, Anthony Richardson, Amari Cooper, Christian Kirk, Rashid White, Joe Mixon, Terry McLaurin. It's going to be interesting, Shawn, to see those sort of names along with the like of a Zamir White and an Alvin Kamara. We did a recent RotoViz Overtime Triflex startup over at the FFPC for a Dynasty League, and some of those kind of names slid quite a considerable amount in terms of where they went on the board. It'll be interesting to see here if people want to take those kind of perceived values, maybe they are values, and put them onto the roster. That's going to be interesting to see how it plays out over the next couple of rounds. We could see some of those sliding through, but tight end Shawn has had a run in that kind of you basically kicked it off with the worthy pick, but we now have 6 tight ends with Kyle Pitts going off at the 401. Again, just reminding there is 17 picks per round, so that makes it a little bit different in terms of like a 401 selection overall. I'm hoping here, Shawn, that one of Allen or Reed probably makes it back to me. JSN would be the other name I'd be looking at this particular point. I think when I name the players, I have to go from that pool unless they all disappear. So I can't take any other player. But Shawn, the other player in my queue is George Kittle. I'm looking to get another wide receiver here. Is there any non-wide receiver that I should be considering at this point?
Well, it seems like it's a good spot for you to dip in there and take your former Green Bay Packer, Aaron Jones. The other running backs are definitely dead zone guys. Rashad White, Joe Mixon, Zamir White, Alvin Kamara, David Montgomery. Those sorts of names. I think we could see them really fall in this. Now, Keenan Allen goes. Colin, did you mention that you picked Zay Flowers in the last round? You sort of snuck that one in on me. You've got a fantastic start here with Olave, Neighbors, and Flowers.
And you can add Jaden Reed to that list.
Jaden Reed.
Yeah. So I was hoping to get that. I thought I kind of had said that one of the names would get to me. I believe I said at the time with great gusto in my voice that T. Higgins, Brandon Ayuk, or Zay Flowers would get to me. The only one that did make it was Zay Flowers, so I was very happy to click him onto the roster. And I was kind of between Flowers, Allen, and Reed. And I have in all my drafts, kind of taken Flowers over those two guys. So to get Reed back was nice. Keenan Allen went 2 picks before, but the wide receivers since my pick were Evans, Pittman, Kirk, Allen, then back again to Reed. So now we're down to Terry McLaurin. So I'm kind of going with the approach, Shawn, of loading up here on the wide receivers early. As we've talked about, there is limited wide receivers that I kind of like in the double-digit rounds. The trouble with this draft is everyone that's drafting has been listening to us all off season, so they know those names. So that's kind of part of the reason that I'm looking to do that and get as many of those higher end wide receivers in as possible before we try and get some of those. I do feel like picking at the spot 11 where I am, even though it's not really, it is the middle of this draft technically, kind of, and that mid range. So you do have an option to see what's happening with the running back position and so on, and see what the names are coming across. You did mention Aaron Jones. I think he is an interesting pick. I was reading some stuff today where it sounded like a lot of the Vikings' plans this season, regardless of who the quarterback was, is to do a lot of checkdowns to the running backs to try then to open things up potentially for the wide receivers by kind of moving some of the pass coverage around to focus on the running backs, which I don't know if it's going to work or not, but that would lead to obviously a lot of work going the way of Aaron Jones and that particular offense. So again, a bit like with Christian Watson, my concern with Jones is always health. And we have talked a good bit, Shawn, about if it will work or if it won't, but I did see Christian Watson did not miss a single day of off-season activities, which is quite remarkable for the way his career has gone so far. So that's a positive note for his drafters. Hopefully he stays healthy all season long. Shawn, I think JSN was probably your prime target coming back to you there potentially. He does go to Shawn's tennis career draft now to the 7 spot. Shawn's back on the clock. Who are we taking? Oh, he gets him. Jordan Addison. Did my talk of checkdowns to the running backs, it didn't fill you with concern?
No. It is amusing here. We do have George Pickens and Amari Cooper, Calvin Ridley, Chris Godwin still available. I want to dip down and get the best players. You can't be fiddling with ADP when you're in a 17-person draft. We are at the point where I do feel like a George Pickens selection is very justified. So we're getting a bit of sense of the fear that comes with Russell Wilson as your quarterback and Arthur Smith as your coordinator at this juncture.
I don't think fear is a strong enough word, Shawn. I did have a, yeah.
We're into the terror phase with George Pickens.
George Pickens, though, feels like a player that we could easily be wrong on and could still have a big season based on pretty much purely a volume based play at this point. I haven't drafted him all off season. Really, I don't know if I've drafted him at all, but he's a player that over the last week I've kind of been like, maybe I'm just completely wrong there. But the Steelers has been solely drafted through Justin Fields and Jalen Warren. Do you think there is a chance that we see him, have a big season this year?
George Pickens?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a chance. I mean, he can get behind the defense. We're going to get Justin Fields. Justin Fields has a big arm. He's going to read the first read. He's going to throw it to that guy if he's open. I mean, I am really wanting George Pickens to go in this next selection so that I don't have to take him.
Take him.
George Kittle still available. I think that is an interesting pick. Amari Cooper still available. He's dealing with a quarterback who has not been able to get his arm right. I mean, there are some interesting names here, but I don't think Jameson Williams is going to come out.
Okay. Now I have a candle lit here for George Kittle to get back. I was kind of, Shawn, hoping there that you were going to go in a different direction. That was my priority target here at this next selection. There is other names, though I do think that that I'm not drafting on a regular basis, but in a format like this, I think become kind of interesting. The likes of Cortland Sutton, but we're down here too. Like I mentioned, Christian Watson. We're down to that kind of Tyler Lockett, Christian Watson area. Jerry Jeudy. They're kind of the names that you want to be reaching down for if you're going for wide receiver here. So it might be a point where different directions have to be gone. How far do you think Pickens would go before he's a good pick, Shawn? I think
it's a good pick here.
I do think I think that it might be a time that I select him if he makes it back to me. Now there's 5 picks to my next selection. I also think that George Kittle at this point would be a standout pick based on the gap that has been at tight end since that last pick. I feel like we're into a flat zone where you're either reaching or you're taking some of those running backs. The likes of Jalen Warren would be a good pick, I think, here for me at this particular point. But again, we are a couple of picks away. We'll see how it plays out.
Colm, are you confident enough in your ability to land running backs that you would? Yeah, that you would go beyond your first 4 picks? Because again, one of the things we talk about is that you don't need depth in the same way in this format. You're going to be able to add players, even with the 17 participants. You're going to be able to add players. It's not the same deal where you're stashing guys and looking to win the race to fill the flex every single week with your wide receiver depth. If you get chopped in week 1, chopped in week 2, having that depth isn't going to help you.
Yeah, that is fair. But I still think that there's, and again, I'm saying there's a lot of George Pickens went. There's a lot of options available at running back as we go through. I almost now do not want to take a running back because it will seem like Shawn has pushed me towards it. So I do think that the pick that I will make will potentially be George Kittle. I was kind of considering going potentially into the quarterback route. CJ Stroud was there. Jaden Daniels is here. I feel like it's George Kittle or Jalen Warren, but I want the George Kittle pick now, Shawn, based on how you've set me up here to. Am I a coward that has to draft a running back before round 5 of a 17-team league. But we'll see.
There are some names here.
I'm 2 picks away.
I'm not gonna push you in any specific direction, but there are some names.
Zamir White.
Well, he's the top guy by Guillotine.
He is a name. He is a name.
Kyler Murray, the top overall player. Well, George Kittle, the top overall player. There is a rank setting and an ADP setting you can filter by Colm. I don't believe that they have given you George Kittle at this price.
Yeah, I think that's the way. I'm going to Shawn. I'm just going to stand in the face of danger here, and I'm just going to pass and run him back again. When you said it all makes complete sense as to why I should draft a running back. But you can draft George Kittle.
Well, you drafted the ADP value. Do you feel good about that? Doesn't that make you? I mean,
Shawn, I almost drafted George Kittle in the last round, so I'm okay with the ADP value.
Okay.
When it's an ADP value and the player is one of the most awesome players in the NFL at the position, I'm okay drafting them at an ADP value.
That's one way to do it. The other way to do it is Xavier Worthy, Jordan Addison, and Jameson Williams.
It is. You've gone for when you're going. There's big swings there. There's big swings. The one that I love, having a draft where Jameson Williams and Jordan Addison are like your wide receiver 5-6 kind of range. How do you feel about them as wide receiver 4, for example, in this situation for Williams?
Well, one of my concerns, one of my fears for week 1 is that Jordan Addison is going to put up 25, Jameson Williams is going to put up 33, and all of those points are going to be on the bench. They're not going to be on the bench for this particular team. Colin, when we think about the tactics of Guillotine leagues, you do want to create as much floor as you can because your goal is to not get chopped. So from that perspective, these guys with the elite vertical ability, players like a Xavier Worthy, players like a Jameson Williams, who might be looking at a far lower target floor in the early going, there are very clear reasons why they wouldn't be the play. Obviously, a little bit of what I'm doing here is having some fun with the draft and getting to put together a team, that otherwise you just don't necessarily get to do. I'm also leaning into just the enthusiasm that I have for these players. I think that it will work. I think that if it does hit, you're talking about having the types of players who, I think that the counter argument would simply be that from a completely serious perspective, if they hit, then they rise up to where I drafted them anyway. And so you've clearly priced out all of the upside. But when we think about a format like this, where we'll be able to add in plenty of floor in free agency as we go along, the real risk to a team like this is that you're going to get chopped early. And then it doesn't matter what a Worthy can be by midseason. It doesn't matter what a Jordan Addison will do once he is able to work through some of these issues that have popped up for him during training camp. It doesn't matter the big games that Jameson Williams will sprinkle in. I do like the fact that if you're going to play 4 receivers, again, in a deep league like this, where most of the other teams are not going to have that same receiving punch anyway, even if they didn't reach, that gives me a bit of an advantage. A lot of the future of my roster is going to come down to whether or not I can execute at tight end and QB to balance out what a variety of teams have done here. Just, quickly perusing the board, we have 4 teams already that have both a QB and a tight end. If they hit on their flex picks, then those teams will be very high powered in terms of the starting lineup. One of the things I love to see here is that not everybody is pursuing it in the same way. If you, do work through a strategy piece, a strategy idea, you make some recommendations, and then every single person follows it. Number one, that's going to be kind of boring. And number two, probably people didn't take the best values, because if everybody follows the recommendations, then it opens up some other holes. It opens up some opportunities. And you like to see in a 17-person room that there is plenty of creativity in how the different drafters are crafting their rosters.
Yeah, and also from different spots, you kind of have to maybe take some different tactics to try and maximize your opportunities throughout the room. And that can even be from round to round as the picture changes. When I was on the clock, I'm kind of hoping that Jalen Warren, Ramondre Stevenson, Chase Brown, those sort of names could potentially sneak their way through. They all went off the board. Even a player that was coming into my view there based on the ADP value was DeAndre Swift, a player that I haven't targeted much, but in this format, I think could be fine. A thing I was going to ask you about, Shawn, with the likes of Swift, he may not have the same kind of floor, but when we look at the likes of a Devin Singletary in this particular format or a Brian Robinson, you talk about some of those wide receivers might be ceiling plays, and now if you have a floor set at running back to get you through those opening weeks before you maybe add some stuff through the waiver wire. And the other part of the floor play element that I was going to talk about is the likes of a Jonathan Brooks or a Nick Chubb, who now are missing 4 weeks. Are they players that it makes it even harder to roster in this format?
It works both directions because you have to build a lineup that works for week 1. If you have some names that are in there and you feel are equivalent, maybe some of the most boring players, but they have a week 1 workload and they can get you through, then stashing someone like a Brooks, who's the equivalent of spending on one of these chopped players, but you can get that value for free. I think you have to at least consider that. Now you're building a more fragile team if you do it that way. And the thing that is so much fun, I think, about the Guillotine League is that it has some of those same types of conflicts that you get when you're playing in a big tournament, where if you're drafting an eliminator, if you're drafting sort of a regular best ball team, where the first thing that you have to do is get through, you can sometimes make some selections that are optimized for that portion that do have some negative trade-offs for the big prize race portion of it. In the Guillotine League, you can be too conservative. You can advance through the first month, but not have a strong enough team, either in terms of the players that you have or the free agent dollars that you have left, because once you get into the second half of the season, it's not going to take a floor type of roster to continue to advance. It's going to take a ceiling type of roster. Drafters are going to be able to start crazy lineups in the second half of the year. Yeah. You just have so many players chopped that go back onto new teams.
Yeah, that's a really fantastic way to put it in terms of, you could get through with some of those floor. And you really have to kind of pick your poison and decide which way you're going to play it. I took Tyjae Spears with my selection there, when Shawn was talking through Zach Moss with one pick before, but the players that I was kind of considering there were Brian Robinson, Devin Singletary, if DeAndre Swift hadn't went, him, and then Spears. And, week 1, those other names might have, more workload, more volume to have points in week 1. But I think, again, it's kind of that balance as if you get into week 4, week 5, I think the upside of Spears is the way to try and advance through it. What I'm kind of thinking is maybe with the running backs in this point, that maybe you can take some of those more like high upside plays that have some standalone value, but then as maybe we see potential, and it hasn't happened in this at all, Shawn, the point I made about the running backs and would they slide a little bit, that hasn't really happened at all at the running back position so far, which is interesting for one of our draft rooms. But I do think that maybe some of the real names that are in, the later rounds that you really try to avoid, maybe they're names that become more appealing to fill out the back end of your roster, which kind of then could almost be your first set of cuts. Like they could be valuable to you in the opening weeks, but maybe they're cuttable then on the waiver wire for some of these higher profile guys. You are up, Shawn, in 2 selections. I have a question to ask you then about the overall roster after you make your next 2 picks to see how things are starting to fill out here. Keon Coleman goes, David Njoku goes. I did think the draft room was going to give Shawn Brock Bowers, but he didn't get back to Shawn. So back on the clock as Dak Prescott goes off the board. Shawn, who's the option here for you?
Yeah, I was hoping that Njoku would make it. He was selected a couple of picks back. That part, pretty unfortunate, maybe. I'm going to... So I look here, there's only one drafter in between me and the next pick who needs a QB. So I can probably push that. I'm going to go ahead and take Jonathan Brooks. I think that waiting...
I had just added him to the queue.
I think that having him later on is going to be, again, a big free agency savings kind of play. The boring guys, once we get into these next rounds, are going to be the perfect complement to the fun players, the shiny players that I drafted in the first 6 rounds.
Yeah, so we'll see who Shawn gets on the way back. But my question was going to be, when we get to that point, in terms of like we get Breece Hall at the start, then you get the 4 wide receivers, now Jonathan Brooks, kind of your overall field for the draft as it is progressing here. Lots of upside, obviously, with Breece Hall. Then you get upside with Jonathan Brooks. You just have to wait 4, 5, or 6 weeks to get it. But a player who I think can be extreme upside this season as well. Shawn, to wit one more pick so far, you've come true on your QB conversation. One of the QBs though has gone. Was he the target, or was one of these other names the target?
No, I was going to grab Jordan Love there. With him gone, we're going to go ahead and add some Jaleel McLaughlin.
Oh, nice pick. Really nice pick. Shawn has been very aggressive in his selections here, but I suppose for people who would be jumping into one of these, Shawn, I'm obviously drafting in the middle, and I have a long way I feel between picks, but be drafting at the 3rd spot, having to kind of wait 30 picks between your selections. How does that alter your strategy as to who you want to add to the roster on those picks?
I don't know that it necessarily alters your strategy a ton. You still take the best players, but I think if you want to have fun with it, it frees you up to not worry so much about getting the ADP values, because if you're at the edges, as you mentioned, anybody in the range that you're looking at, even 12, 13, 14 picks later, they're not going to come back to you. So you are freed up in a way that is just beautiful in this day and age. In 2024, if you can feel freed of the constraints of ADP, that it's a big, I think, weapon in your favor. But as I'm working through it, I'm trying to figure out where is the upside at the same time. But even if I'm making some, we'll say extremely aggressive as opposed to silly, even if I'm making aggressive selections, I'm looking at it from a structural perspective where I'm trying to eke out essentially extra picks. So you add the Brooks name in there. That's like having an additional 2nd round pick in this format. You take the vertical receivers. If they actually get volume, it's like having an additional pick. But you look at someone like a McLaughlin, as you mentioned, the standalone value element there in a different type of draft. Maybe you're trying to wait and see where he would go. Now, again, he's not going to come back to me, so I don't have to worry about that part of it. If you have him as the clear-cut pick in a vacuum, you can just make that play. I think when you look at the starting lineup here, I have the 2 running backs, I have the 4 wide receivers. That handles that 2 running back, 2 wide receiver, 2 flex need. I would have liked for Jordan Love to come 1 pick back. I do think there are some names that will probably fall in this draft, like a Gus Edwards, like possibly a J.K. Dobbins, like an Ezekiel Elliott. It's a very real possibility that Elliott goes out there and catches 6 or 7 passes in week 1. And that by itself helps get you through. Jerome Ford, a name that goes here at 709. He's an excellent pick for this. That's a team that started Garrett Wilson, Cooper Kupp, Josh Jacobs, James Conner, Kyler Murray, Tony Pollard, Jerome Ford. So in that case, you can do it the opposite. You've got your 2 wide receivers, but then you have your 2 running backs and your 2 flex spots filled. Pollard and Ford, probably pretty good week 1 outlooks from a volume perspective. You're going to get a mobile QB, which is certainly valuable in this specific format. Colm, you were up at the 7-11. Which direction are you going to go?
Always open, Shawn. 7-11 here. We get, I go with Blake Corum. And this is where you start to see a picture of, like, you mentioned like the floor plays in week 1. Like there's very little floor there for Corum. I think they'll be working, there'll be points, but there's concern as well that maybe they do just go a little bit again with Kyron Williams. So adding him, the other options there, Shawn, Jalen Wright, Braylon Allen. I'm looking at running back at this point. Like if we look through the board, it is quarterback, tight end, and then there is a number of those running backs. So you are having to move down the board. I'm kind of trying to see how it plays out here in terms of, I'm sure people are using the RotoViz rankings. I'm sure people are looking a little bit at the ADP queues on the Guillotine Leagues platform, and there's a big gap between where those 2 particular players go. So my goal would be to see if I can get Wright to come back as well to me, or Braylon Allen, Bucky Irvin. So when we're looking at the name, Trey Benson's probably the other running back that I would have went for, but you're looking at like Rico Dowdle, and I know some people are much higher on Rico Dowdle's outlook than maybe I have been in terms of the players I've been drafting this offseason. But again, maybe he is a player that fits that, and he's after getting drafted, that fits that, perceived week 1 floor. But I think that I can't strongly say that he has a more of a week 1 floor at running back than Blake Corum, and I think that Corum has a higher upside as the season goes along. Was there any other players, Shawn, in the mix for you there? Like some of the wide receivers, like Jerry Jeudy's the last wide receiver just after getting drafted. If I didn't have the 4 wide receivers that I start with, that would have been the direction I would have went. But I felt like, again, in terms of building out your starting lineup, that running back made the most sense there.
Yeah, I have to be honest in that I don't have a lot of visibility into what the Rams are going to do.
I don't think anyone does, Shawn. They're both kick and punt returners. I don't think there is a clear answer until, and I think there's a lot of teams that I don't think there's a clear answer until the game is played this week and we see what the snap shares are, we see what the actual usage is. I think there's a lot of smoke and mirrors so far at this point of even at this point of the offseason. And when we look at like how teams would have played, more preseason minutes in the past, like some teams this year just decided that they weren't going to play preseason. And then certain players like decided that like, I don't need to be in training camp, all training camp. Like it really doesn't seem to matter. Like, we'll see what happens with the likes of Ayuk, Chase, Lamb. I think the teams aren't overly concerned about sharing that information with us. And obviously they're trying to keep a lot of it as close to the vest. I think we'll see that Williams is the clear running back 1, and it's a heavy split in his favor. But I also think that both of them are going to be used. Like the thing that's going to be interesting come this week is how teams do approach the new kickoff rules and how things play in from that perspective. So I think there's a lot that's going to be interesting, like right off the bat from week 1.
Well, one of the things with the Rams is that they are one of the teams that actually could use the starter almost exclusively. And so that's one of the things that I'm looking at as a risk for Blake Corum. There's probably also a fairly substantial talent gap between the 2 players. And yet there is certainly enough smoke that Corum will be involved to think that he'll have a week 1 role. I guess I would think that, if we're looking at a 70-30 with Williams and Corum to the incumbent, we could be looking at, a 70-30 for Rico in Dallas, to where he would be much better positioned from that perspective. Would he end up with the high value touches? I mean, one of the things for Dowdle is that he could play 70-30 and not catch the passes, and you end up getting
not get the red zone work potentially.
I guess I think he will. That's what training camp has somewhat indicated. I mean, the thesis for Dowdle is based on the fact that even the Cowboys themselves are like, well, we like the pass blocking. You know, the Patriots last year threw him a bunch of passes behind the line of scrimmage and he caught them and then he ran forward for a few yards. There's some value in that. But the Cowboys signed him and they're like, whoa, this guy doesn't push the pile. He doesn't have any burst. We need to look at Dalvin Cook. Rico's the better player in practice. It's a tricky one. I do think that he's probably a good pick in the middle of round 7 there, although there are still lots of guys that I think are similar picks that maybe have more opening month floor still yet. And so if it's that portion that people are going for, I think those names are still available. The last 4 picks at receiver are interesting in Rashid, Wicks, Mitchell, and Shakir. Those guys are basically the discount version of what I selected with my roster. I certainly can't be criticizing people for taking vertical players in terms of Rashid, Wicks, and Mitchell most specifically when I spent the high value picks on those guys. We'll see if they do have enough, this combination of talent and role to draw those targets that would give you floor enough to play them in a lineup in this type of format. Colm, you have 30 seconds. Chuba Hubbard did not get back to you. He goes 1 pick early. Is that a name that you were considering?
It wasn't, but again, based on what we're talking about here with week 1 floor, probably would have been a smart one to factor in, but he wasn't, so I don't feel as bad missing out. I did mention, Shawn, at that last pick, I was kind of between Jalen Wright, Blake Corum, and Braylon Allen. And when we're talking through kind of some of the stuff that you're mentioning there in terms of like the week 1, I find it, and we probably will get some carries in that for Wright, but I find it hard to believe that he will have a substantial week 1 role based on, Mostert and Achane in front of him. So when we look then at the situation with Braylon Allen, who is in there obviously with one of the best running backs in the league, who Shawn has drafted in Breece Hall, I do feel like there's a easier path for him to get work in week 1 versus how things are going to be spread around in Miami at the opening week of the season. Would you agree with me on that? That, off the bat, while the chance of him becoming the actual starter is impossible without an injury, the standalone work for him is probably clearer in the opening 3 weeks than you would with a Jalen Wright.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's still that question of, would you ever be able to play Allen in this specific format if you don't get a Breece Hall injury? And maybe I'm adjusting my thinking too much on it, because I agree with you that Allen is going to have some standalone value. It is an element where I think guys like Corum and Allen may be free agent drops for you pretty early, simply because you're going to have some other names that you can add to the roster. It's a little bit of a matter of how you want to manage week 1. I think
it can feel like that when you're through these opening 8 rounds, but I do think that when you have the entire draft done, that there's going to be players that are much further down the pecking order than those names that would be easy cuts. I'm kind of thinking that they are going to probably make 2 of those, obviously will make the lineup in week 1, and I'm hoping to make it through that. But I think that you're hoping that there's a progression throughout the season for those guys that leads to them being more valuable. You may still have to cut them, but if we look through the draft at this point of the actual draft, there's a huge amount of names here, even in the 8th round, that would be prime cuts off your roster when it comes to, even that week 1, week 2 waiver wire runs. So I don't necessarily think basically taking the shots on those players there is that much of a negative. And if they became the back end of roster players rather than, the players that you're having at this point, I think that you can still fill in with the waiver wire picks above them with players that you'll draft after this point.
I've got a couple of different draft windows open, so I am finding out that I'm on the clock in stereo.
How many picks have you to make, Shawn?
Trying to deduce the picks from the drafters at the turn. I have 2 drafters in between me here. I'm just going to go ahead and make another stash.
So Shawn is telling me that the players I have are, cuttable. Just a note here that the players that Shawn have are on injured reserve. Who did you add, Shawn?
A little Nick Chubb.
Yeah,
Nick Chubb for that lineup there.
Yeah. So I guess the part here that Shawn is doing that I really do like so far is, Breece Hall, Jaleel McLaughlin are in the lineup week 1 so far, and you're kind of having those high upside plays stashed on the bench, which I do think I prefer versus my approach, because there's not a definitive starting pair. Tyjae Spears is certainly going to be one of them, along with who. That will be decided as the draft goes on. There is a few names that I think could be added in. One of the names that is after getting drafted that I was tempted by again, because I think there's week 1 work there as well. But I think the upside is more capped for him, and that was Charbonnet. You mentioned Dobbins. At this point, again, another backfield that I don't truly feel the picture will be clear until the team's out there in week 1. How do you see that? Do you think Gus Edwards is a clear one there in terms of the team's plans, along with J.K. Dobbins probably as the 2, and then Vidal? How do you see it play? Like, there's a lot of ways that this could play out over the next 2 weeks.
I think the unfortunate thing is that it's highly likely that you're going to see Gus Edwards play at the goal line. You're going to see him play in short yardage. You're going to see him play on 1st and 10. You're going to get some J.K. Dobbins between the 20s. You're going to get him some in the passing game. If he's even active, you're going to get Vidal out there for a handful of snaps here and there. And the question will be, can he flash to the level of, say, a Keaton Mitchell in order to earn some opportunity? And it will be tough because there should be a contrast between Vidal and the veterans. And yet it's not going to be something where he gets out there and sprints for 50 yards. You don't have that 4.3 speed that Mitchell brings to the table. If you can't do something pretty startling, it's going to be difficult to wrest the starting job away from the veterans that the coaching staff is fine with. And I think that's especially true in a season where the Chargers probably don't truly plan to be competitive. Now, they plan to compete, so it's a different type of thing. But if they bring some of the young players along slowly, if they give some deference to the veterans that they have brought in and almost certainly made, not promises exactly, but I mean, there is a connection between Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins and this coaching staff. Unless they're absolutely awful, I think it's going to take some time. Now, Kamani is somebody that you should have on a huge chunk of your redraft teams, but I would be surprised. I'm optimistic always. I would love for it to be the case. I think that out of the entire group of young players that we're drafting, that somebody is going to emerge in week 1. We've got to keep our expectations in check, though, across the board. It's very unlikely that a bunch of guys emerge. It's unlikely that all of the names who will eventually be the new 0 RB standouts, that those guys take the job over in week 1. That's not what we are expecting. It's not what history tells us is going to happen. You have to be willing to go into week 1 relaxed and patient, while at the same time putting a starting lineup out there that will keep you in the mix, right? The idea is not that we're going to drop 50, 100, 150 points back in the various formats. There simply aren't enough weeks to make all of that up if we're hemorrhaging huge point totals. I mean, I say that, and I mean, I've had some teams in the past where in the final, 3 weeks, they made up 200 points. You're expecting to have rosters that put up, 180 consistently, if they would also be teams that would have you in the mix to win $1 million here, $1 million there, what have you.
I'm back on the clock, Shawn. I'm going to ask you a question.
Okay.
Are you ready for an aggressive pick at running back?
I hope you're going to select someone who normally goes undrafted after setting it up like that.
Can you guess who the name is?
Let me pull up the queue here.
Oh, he's way down the queue.
Dylan Laube.
No.
Samaje Perine.
That's who it is. Let's get some week 1 points in here, I think. There's my RB2.
That's an aggressive take on Isaiah Pacheco.
Yeah. I didn't say he was the RB1 for the Chiefs. I said that he was the RB2 on my roster.
But you said something about week 1 points.
Yeah. You think there's no points coming on Thursday Night Football here for the third down back?
Colm, I can't even really talk about it. I'm so optimistic. I have so much Perine now.
Yeah.
You catch 4 passes. You end up in the right spot where you're in at the goal line instead of Pacheco. You put up 17 points.
I only need like 4 with this roster so far. If I get 4 running back points, I just need to be not the worst team this week, Shawn. I can deal with running back after that.
I do think that there is an element where we have both drafted as though we're trying to be the second worst team, which, I mean, that puts you in the mix to get chopped.
We're just we're looking forward to that waiver run in week 2 to save our season. We do, though. I think the Perine is a fun play to add, because when we're looking at players who the outlook could be, I know you're saying you're optimistic, but the outlook could be dramatically different entering week 2, week 3. If he has a substantial role in this offense, the picture is completely changed. So I'm not expecting him to have the clear share of the work in terms of that running back room, but I think there's enough there to make him very, very viable to have on your roster. And the names I have are kind of more longer term plays. I think, like, when we look down through the running backs that are available at this point, Antonio Gibson, Khalil Herbert, Tyrone Tracy, Tank Bigsby, Jamal Williams, Cam Akers, Justice Hill, Audric Estime, Miles Sanders, Laube, who you mentioned there, Rashawn Johnson. There's a lot of question marks. So I think I'll take the question mark on the best offense in the NFL. I think that's the question mark that I'll take.
Yeah, and Perine has had some good peripherals in 2022 when he was taking the starting job from Joe Mixon there at the end of the season, taking the high value touches at least. He was much better than Mixon that year. And not only was that not the end of Mixon's career, but he played another year for the Bengals. He is now the starter for the Houston Texans. And that's, I think, a relevant note as we think about guys like Dalvin Cook, who, have been good more recently than Ezekiel Elliott, good more recently than Joe Mixon. If you end up in the right opportunity, one of the reasons that Mixon is probably going to be pretty valuable is that offense should move the ball at will, and the backups to Joe Mixon are Dameon Pierce and Cam Akers. Similar kind of situation in Dallas, where the starters but potential backups are Ezekiel Elliott and Rico Dowdle.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Shawn, I'm looking at a situation here where I have a tight end already in George Kittle. But looking at the players available, I feel like the clear best player available at this point off the draft is TJ Hawkinson. If you're looking non-quarterback, how detrimental is that to my season to stash an elite tight end at this point?
I think it could help you. I do think that tight end is a position that ends up being very inexpensive on the waiver wire. I thought a little bit about stashing Hawkinson, but then the roster ends up being a little bit absurd. If you miss on your week 1 pickups and you don't get the production you're looking for. So, for example, if I don't get production from McLaughlin, if I find out that one of those receivers is basically not going to play, I don't really have any options if I'm stashing just a bunch of players, because I think the other names don't help you a ton in this format. So you want to balance those types of things. You don't want to get too extreme. You are up. You have 40 seconds.
I do think that
Hawkinson, an interesting pick here. I do think there's a difference, though, too, between guys who are going to miss the first 4 weeks, and it seems likely that Hawkinson
I think he'll come back after the bye. Yeah. So, Shawn, I don't know if this guy was going to be your target, then, that you've just talked me into drafting Jalen Tolbert.
Jalen Tolbert, that's a good selection.
Oh, I see. I've auto drafted Rashad Bateman. That wasn't the intention, Shawn.
No, that's the previous drafter. You've taken Tolbert there.
Okay, thankfully. I have seen some heavy pub over the last 24 hours on Bateman. What's the optimistic side of Bateman? Rebounding, in a healthy season. Obviously, there was a lot of talk last year that he was healthy. It looks like it certainly wasn't the case throughout the preseason and the season itself. But lots of buzz coming from the Baltimore Ravens side of things, particularly player-based, more so than anything, that Bateman looks to be all systems go this season.
Yeah, I mean, that would be great for them. He was a fantastic prospect. Their offense isn't really set up to support additional people. We've been a little bit skeptical of Mark Andrews, pretty enthusiastic really about Zay Flowers. There just is not going to be a lot of passing volume. And Rashad Bateman, even when he wasn't injured in the past, wasn't what he was drafted to be. In this range, if you're getting someone in an elite offense with buzz, I don't think there's any problem with that. There can be this temptation to keep going back to the well on some of these guys when you like them originally. Colm, there's going to be someone who is in that situation and we don't go back to the well and they do make the jump back to where they were or beyond that, to where we thought they could get to.
Yeah.
And in that situation, you second guess yourself a lot. But at this point, the history of guys, and this is something you can find out from a lot of players' research as well, injuries are not a great reason to actually elevate receivers. I think there's a difference between a J.K. Dobbins, say, and a Rashad Bateman. You could certainly say there's a difference between a Javonte Williams and a Rashad Bateman in terms of the types of things that we're looking for when we make bets at certain prices. Again, Bateman could be the guy who ends up hitting, and then it's going to seem like the rhetoric out of camp was correct. One of the things I think on this type of topic is simply anytime that the team, the players beat the drum for a certain guy and it works, then everybody's like, well, it was obvious. They told us this is going to happen. And everyone forgets about the vast majority of cases like that, where the evidence-based take, the accumulation of data from the reps, from the play on the field in the past, tells you what a guy is. It can be tough because I think that especially now with social media and the intense competition, for a wide variety of things, and this need to look right all the time, there's the temptation for fantasy analysts to chase all of those things too, because you're not going to be that heavily criticized if you simply relate the fact that, oh, the team says this guy's going to be good. Why don't you take him when the price is in that range? And I don't think it's a problem if you're necessarily doing that. I don't think it's a problem from a process perspective if you're only doing it to kind of cover yourself.
That's all very fair. The player that Shawn has drafted here, Shawn, Trevor Lawrence, added to the roster. We are in a situation here where like quarterback has really quietened down over the last 3 rounds. We did have the Jordan Love pick that you talked about. Then Williams went shortly after that. Then Jared Goff, but Brock Purdy went in the 8th. No quarterbacks went in the 9th, and now in the 10th pick at the 3rd last pick. Which, trying to work this out in my head, I think it's the 10-15. Shawn, you have taken Trevor Lawrence in this format. Is there any reason that, as I say that, the team in 1 has taken Justin Herbert as a second quarterback to Jalen Hurts? Is there any real reason to take a second quarterback, unless you obviously go so late that you want options? But you're kind of really looking here, I think, for a quarterback in week 1, and then see what happens with that team that potentially gets cut. So I think so far I may be the only team without a quarterback now that you have drafted.
Team 16.
Team
also.
16 as well. Yeah. So obviously you take Lawrence. I think it's a nice pick to add to the roster, but how much, like, is that you take one quarterback and wait? Do you think you would add another one later?
I think especially if you have weaker quarterbacks, you can take a couple. There's also an element where the draft is going to be deep enough that at some point QBs start to go again because drafters don't like any of their other options. There's the potential to stream some of these late guys a little bit. And by stream, I just mean, you can play the matchups. You can get the game that has an exploitable pass defense or an extremely high over under. You can protect yourself against an injury. You can protect yourself against appearing to be completely wrong with your thesis after week 1. If you do get a guy hurt and almost all of the quarterbacks are rostered, then you may be put in a position where you do actually have to bid somewhat aggressively for QBs in week 2 to avoid the week 2 chop, which anytime that you spend at QB in this format, it's a pretty big disaster.
So what you're telling me is I should not wait any further on quarterback and still shouldn't draft TJ Hawkinson with my next pick if he's available. I was kind of wondering there, Shawn, were you setting up to get yourself a nice stash of TJ Hawkinson with getting me to bypass him? But you do take Marvin Mims as the wide receiver. He was the other wide receiver I was considering when I did take Jalen Tolbert. So a lot of, I think, Shawn, it's a wide range of outcomes wide receiving room, but there's a lot of upside across there. And one of the games, like, I'm obviously not a Broncos fan, but one of my biggest investments in fantasy football this year has been that Denver Broncos offense. So I'm pretty excited to see how that plays out this weekend. I'm just very excited in general to see some proper NFL football back out there again and to get this fantasy football season started. We've obviously talked a long way throughout the offseason, Shawn, about it, but it's going to be a whole bunch of fun when things kick off. Well, Thursday night football, the Packers then playing on Friday, which I'm excited about, and then we get the main course on Sunday. Any particular points that you're most excited for, or just the entire package in general? It's like, opening up some presents and seeing some of the presents will not be good. Let's make that very clear. Some of the presents that these teams unveil for us, we will want to, have our receipt and return them for like a gift voucher or something. But I think in general, this is going to be an awesome season.
Yeah, and you just have to go into it with the right mentality and remember the part of being aggressive, but also having that humility-based drafting approach is that you're going to be wrong a lot. You don't want to be shocked or psychologically crushed when you are wrong. That's going to happen. You're going to have some injuries that matter. That's one of the reasons why we build in a lot of depth in the way that we construct, but also the way we think about the teams. I'm very excited about these 2 games to start. You have 2 games where you could have AFC, NFC championship previews. You could be looking at the Super Bowl contenders from both conferences in these opening games. I'm excited to see if your Green Bay Packers are ready to take the next step. I think it's possible that they blow out the Philadelphia Eagles, but I'm optimistic that the Eagles will come out and, get the ball to Devontae Smith, that they will have Will Shipley in a package of plays. And that's one where he hasn't yet gone in this draft, even though players that aren't particularly good are being drafted. We're into that section of the draft. We talk about being patient. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the guys that we like are healthy scratches week one. That's something you have to manage as well. I want to see what the Denver Broncos look like. I really want to see what Brock Bowers is able to do. Is he healthy? I think that the Atlanta Falcons should be fantastic. We want to see if Kyle Pitts is healthy and what Kirk Cousins is able to do when he has those two weapons plus a Darnell Mooney. What is Bijan Robinson able to do with a real offensive coordinator? Those teams have a lot of excitement attached to them, I think. I can't wait for what the rookie receivers do. Malik Neighbors, is he going to go off with a 12-catch opening week? Are the Arizona Cardinals with Kyler Murray going to light the world on fire, go a little scorched earth? You get 7 or 8 catches for McBride, 7 or 8 catches for Harrison, Dortch involved, Michael Wilson involved. Do they put up 40 points? These teams that have held back and haven't shown anything, how does that work? Because there's something extremely valuable about going into the season healthy. And at the same time, we're talking about very slim margins for a lot of these teams. You have a team like the Bengals that look like they're in disarray again. And the Bengals feel like they have the type of team that can get back to the Super Bowl, right? If you've been too conservative and you're not ready to play in the first 2 or 3 weeks, and we're going to find out, there are going to be 5 or 6 teams that are very clearly not ready to play. Yeah. Most of those teams will probably be teams that are just in the building process anyway. But there will be some of these games could determine, who has the number 1 seed, right? Thursday, Friday night, you're talking about tiebreakers for the number 1 seed. The Chiefs came from the non-top seed last year. We've had that happen several times, but the 1 seed has a huge advantage in the current playoff format. There are only a very limited number of games in an NFL season, which is one of the reasons that it's so tense for reality and, so high action, high intensity, high drama for fantasy football as well.
Yeah, the other part, Shawn, is there will be some of these teams that are going to be very good teams that, like you're saying, aren't ready, don't turn up right. And, it's that balance as well of where do we overreact, where do we underreact? That's one of my favorite things that we do each year is talk through some of the things that we should make sure you overreact to and make sure that maybe you don't overreact to. And there's going to be a lot of that this week where people will be written off for certain reasons. People will be, people will think certain players are not up to scratch, that maybe we were completely wrong where they were drafted. But it's a long season, Shawn. You have to be in it for the long haul. Even looking back, I was talking to Zachary Kruger this week and talking about Trey McBride, but going back to the early weeks last season with Trey McBride, where he's stuck behind Zach Ertz, it's a long season. Lots of things happen. Teams will develop, situations will develop, and hopefully they develop quicker than that situation developed last season. But we are back up, Shawn. This is a 14-round draft as well, so we have 3 selections each to make. We didn't talk about it, Shawn. I just thought, let's swing for the fences one more time. Bo Nix is the quarterback of this roster. Did pass up options like Matthew Stafford, Deshaun Watson, and Baker Mayfield, Aaron Rodgers. I don't know if Shawn's laughing that I've drafted Bo Nix again or that it was a very aggressive decision to do. I am back here. You mentioned, though, the option of taking that late quarterback and then adding another option. I'm considering here adding Aaron Rodgers. I have a couple of running backs also in the queue that just do not excite me. So Shawn, for old time's sake, I might add a second QB here. Draft Aaron Rodgers.
So Rodgers was the player that Ben and I ended up with on our Guillotine team after we inadvertently timed out when we were trying to decide between Kirk Cousins and Geno Smith. Aaron Rodgers, definitely a consolation choice there. These are some interesting rosters that we've built, Colm. I don't feel at all like we are safe from the week one chop. We are into the range now where the top receivers by ADP are Roman Wilson, Jahan Dotson, DJ Chark, Ricky Pearsall, Tyler Boyd, Malachi Corley. That gives you a little bit of a feel for, why we would have waited at QB, because you still are getting starters at the quarterback position where that's not necessarily the case everywhere else. The top running backs are Jamal Williams, Deontay Foreman, Miles Sanders, Dylan Laube, Alexander Madison. Probably not a lot of early season punch from those guys. At tight end, Jonnu Smith, Cade Otton, Chig Okonkwo, Colby Parkinson, Michael Mayer, Mike Gesicki, Greg Dulcich. Colm, you've been freed to take Dulcich, and he's still out there.
He's coming back. He's coming back.
You're letting him float.
He's coming back. 13th round pick. We'll get him on there. I will. I actually kind of hope, just for the for the fun, for whichever listener does draft him, I hope that somebody takes Dulcich, just for them to get some enjoyment out of my pain. But yeah, I took the option, Shawn, when I was on the clock, was really for a QB in round 11. I felt like one of Stafford or Rodgers probably would get back. So they're kind of like, if week one, what the Broncos looks, incredibly bad, there's a little bit of an insurance play with Rodgers, but it also means that you do have a secondary option if you without having to spend much in the way of waiver wire dollars, which I don't think would have been the case anyway. But when we're looking at the opportunity cost at that point, I think for me, it's fair to take that second quarterback. The players that I was looking at were Sanders, Laube, and TJ Hawkinson at the next pick, and then it was down to the running back. So I may again get caught out here, but there's some running backs that I do like that may still get back. I'm also thinking that Spears and P. Ryan are my week one running backs, and that I'm waiting for that week two waiver wire to pick up my RB1. $1,000, please.
So Colm has figured out his strategy. He's not going to be around at the end. He's going to use all of his money early. I have selected Jalen Hyatt. I'm trying to build in the most verticality you possibly can to a fantasy roster. I may have the fewest locked in week one targets, but the most air yards.
You may have, yeah, that's what I was going to say. You may win the air yards championship here with this team, Shawn.
The other name that I was considering, Kendre Miller, does go one pick later. Dylan Laube had gone one pick before. DJ Chark, I think a pretty interesting name, one pick before that. Shawn's tennis career took Justin Fields. That was the QB that I was looking at stashing. He is a fantastic option for this particular format. I believe he would have been the QB5 in this scoring system back in 2022.
Obviously, he wouldn't have got back to me because you've mentioned you were considering him. I was kind of thinking about skipping on Rodgers to see if Fields came back, but obviously that wasn't the case. Maybe Rodgers would have got back.
So you mentioned whether or not we can wait on the QB position. The QBs remaining here: Deshaun Watson, Baker Mayfield, Will Levis, Bryce Young, Sam Darnold, Russell Wilson, Derek Carr, Drake May, Gardner Minshew, Daniels. I mean, there's still quite a few names in that group. The ones who are probably the most interesting would be Levis if you want to sell the passing profile and just take kind of a fantasy type of value. Drake May, not going to start in week one, but an interesting guy if you end up getting him out there in weeks 2, weeks 3, somewhere in that range, because his fantasy specific profile also very good. Colm, we're we're into the portion where even someone who is almost certainly not going to play in week 1 becomes a little bit interesting as a stash. I have taken Dalvin Cook 2 rounds remain.
Yeah, I do think that your roster allows you to take those shots in terms of, like, we talked about and it's not the right way really to think about it, but if you're the second worst team, you advance. But with Breece Hall and with Jaleel McLaughlin, you should be able to cope with the running back position if your wide receivers can bring you through then at that particular point. But Dalvin Cook, Nick Chubb, Jonathan Brooks, I feel like in this format might not have worked as well on my particular roster, but they're all very good plays in terms of what the outlook would be in terms of moving forward. And you can also, like, if Dalvin Cook gets cut by the Cowboys, you can also obviously cut him from this particular team. The players that I mentioned at that last pick, Miles Sanders is still available. I would enjoy if he came back here. But again, just a player that in a best ball environment, I have drafted quite a bit of, and I'm happy to do that in the later rounds. But when it's something where you have to click to put them into the lineup, I do feel that that's going to be a little bit challenging, here certainly in week 1. So when we talked about earlier, some of those names, the younger guys that, maybe you don't cut, Sanders is probably a player you can draft here, and if it doesn't work out, pretty easily cut. It feels like, Shawn, if I do that, I'm making a lot of bets off the running backs that you've drafted so far. Trey Sermon goes at that point. I feel just for the context of my love for Greg Dulcich that I probably should draft him at this next pick if he makes it to me, but it'll be between him and Sanders at the moment. Is there any other names here that you're looking at and would be in consideration here for you at this particular point of this draft, where it really is a case of just whatever players you would like to add to your roster that you can go ahead and do that?
I don't know that tight end is all that helpful from the perspective of you would need to put him in the lineup. We've talked about how these guys are going to be pretty inexpensive in free agency. This is regular PPR. You don't have the premium. They're probably not that viable as flex selections. And yet the tight ends, there are tight ends still available who probably will play a lot in week 1. That's not necessarily the case at the other positions. So you want to balance out the type of volume and what you're looking for there. So you select Miles Sanders. Alexander Madison immediately goes after.
I do feel that on the tight end point that if you have a high upside tight end that and I know people disagree with me in certain ways of the actual upside of Greg Dulcich, but it's a time where you can have a look at that player for obviously a very low cost in this format. And if it doesn't work out, he's obviously somebody who you can move on from. You wouldn't be looking to start him obviously in week 1. This is a team though with George Kittle, and you can start multiple tight ends in this format if you had to. Now, obviously it's not tight end premium, so the advantage isn't as strong. But if you have a tight end who is, getting volume and putting up obviously enough fantasy points, you could certainly make him flex worthy in those bye weeks if that came to be the situation. If we're looking at heading into week 8, week 9, who's potentially scoring more points between Jalen Tolbert and Greg Dulcich, I think there's an argument that your flex play on the bye weeks could be a tight end if they're strong enough play. The trouble is that is he a strong enough play?
So we are into round 14. A couple of quarterbacks there to start. Deshaun Watson, Bryce Young. You have 2. We now have seven teams with the 2 quarterbacks. The last round here will be interesting. We have Jonnu Smith is taken by a team that has Trey McBride and Isaiah Likely. The most recent wide receiver picks, just to get a feel for how picked over that spot is, the 12-17, it's hilarious to say 12-17, was Jordan Whittington. Then we had Brendan Rice, Ricky Pearsall, Treylon Burks, Jalen Naylor, Josh Reynolds, and now Olamide Zacchaeus. at the receiver positions. Colm, they're leaving your guy for you very purposefully. Very purposefully.
He got back.
Everyone will be so bad. So sad.
I have to do it, Shawn. I have to do it.
You have to.
I don't care if I get cut in week 1. I've won the draft.
Greg Dulcich in the final. Does it
the
give
other
you
player I
pause
added,
that you selected Greg Dulcich after players who may be inactive? Not for this draft, but for some of our other teams?
And particularly who?
Well, like all of these receivers.
Oh, you mean the receivers, not the tight ends? I thought you meant the tight ends.
No.
Yeah. Oh, there's a load of guys here that the one player, Shawn, that was my backup that I don't know. He just, I thought he was never going to get drafted, was Roman Wilson, who I, again, haven't drafted this offseason. And you mentioned about some of the concerns with the Steelers offense. I feel at that point of the draft that he probably should have went a considerable portion earlier than he did. Goes in the 14th round, as you mentioned, after. And again, he may not be involved, but there was a huge gap there to get to Roman Wilson. Who would you rather have in your roster, Shawn, Roman Wilson or Greg Dulcich?
I would prefer Greg Dulcich, but I mean, that team had their tight ends covered. Pat Freiermuth, Mike Gesicki. I am up for my final pick here. I am going to take Drake May. I've got the 2 upside players in Trevor Lawrence and Drake May. If we get that week 1 benching for Jacoby Brissett, which does seem possible, I'll be able to withstand a few more weeks without bidding at the QB position. I mean, my fervent hope is that Trevor Lawrence has the type of week where I'm not really looking to do much at QB for a while.
Yeah, and I think May is like at the third last pick there for you is a really strong way to play it. Daniel Jones was 1 pick after. I kind of feel, Shawn, and the order that I took them in may not have been, it worked out, but basically the players that were in my queue for those last 5 rounds were Tolbert, Nix, Sanders, and Dulcich. So I added Aaron Rodgers into that. I kind of felt like that was the players that I was trying to add, and I kind of did it in a roundabout way to get them all on the team. So I'm going to say my team, Shawn, then you can say yours, then we can decide which of the 2 of us is getting cut in week 1. So it's Aaron Rodgers, Bo Nix, Blake Corum, Braylon Allen, Tyjae Spears, Samaje Perine, Miles Sanders, Chris Olave, Jalen Tolbert, Zay Flowers, Jaden Reed, Malik Neighbors, George Kittle, Greg Dulcich. I think I might squeeze through based on the wide receiver, tight end power, and I'll have to make a big decision whether I start Aaron Rodgers or Bo Nix this week. But I have an option there of which way I want to do it. I think I'll make it through week 1. The running backs are going to be a severe work in progress, though, I think.
Yeah, I would have loved for you to get a stronger RB2 with the decision to wait at quarterback. And yet again, that really underlines the tensions, the decisions that you have to make in this format. Because this is a format that really is through 6 rounds. That's where the value is. But that's not all of the starters, right? You're going to start 8 people. So how you manage that part and what you do in rounds 7 and 8 to build out that lineup and to get through, it's going to be interesting to track all of these different teams. You mentioned how you think you're set up. Do you feel like you made any mistakes?
I feel like the running back, like if I had, I think I would rather have Jaleel McLaughlin than Blake Corum 1v1, but I also thought that Jaleel may have got back to me in the 8th round until you drafted him and didn't let him get back to me. So I think in hindsight, that would be something I would change. Like the first 5 picks that I had in Olave, Neighbors, Flowers, Reed, and Kittle, I wouldn't change any of those. And then when it got to the point of, Tyjae Spears was, I thought, the best running back option. Like I could have went for a Singletary or a Robinson there and maybe hit some more week 1 floor. But the options for Blake Corum, again, the players that I could have taken really at that point would have been Jalen Wright, Jaleel McLaughlin, Zach Charbonnet, or J.K. Dobbins. I would have preferred out of those names to have Jaleel McLaughlin than Blake Corum, but I was kind of trying to play the entire running back room out. I do like the Samaje Perine play, and obviously that again, there's a wide range of outcomes for that. But I think that if he technically is the running back too, and the other guys are behind that, I think the running back room will be fine. If I get through week 1, then I'm gonna get Breece Hall on the waiver wire in week 2, as Shawn's gonna be eliminated.
I love it. That is very possible. I've taken the gunslinging approach that we like to joke about, sort of exaggerated that a bit for this draft. Looking through it, and if you take those 4 receivers as being, the normal guys who would go there and look at it structurally as opposed to on a player-by-player basis, I do think the interesting thing in this particular draft is that selecting Evan Ingram or George Kittle in round 5 would have positioned me to address really all of the starters, because Cortland Sutton came back to me in round 6. DeAndre Hopkins and Jerry Jeudy went in round 7. There were some additional names that are interesting, like Romeo Doubs, who could run the most routes for the Packers. Tyler Lockett, who may be much more involved than people are currently thinking for the Seahawks. So round 7 actually did have some receiver names. We had a very hard pivot to running backs in that 4, 5, 6 range. We had the majority of drafters decide to go for a QB and a tight end. So receiver was deeper. I think in that way, both of our teams backfired slightly because we each had 4 receivers in the first 5 rounds, and we're not maybe as well positioned to take advantage of those round 7 values. Now, having said that, obviously we like the fact that we've got a very good base at the wide receiver position.
Yeah, so I think it's going to be fun. We'll keep an update on this as it goes along. Obviously, if myself or Shawn get eliminated, we will mention that on the shows, and I'll tell you if I'm successful in picking up Breece Hall off waiver wires. But I think it's a real fun format, and I do appreciate each and every one of the listeners who have jumped in and done the draft. It's always a great time to have that kind of interaction with the RotoViz Overtime community. So, as I mentioned a few times, we will probably do some of these throughout the off season, and the number of competitors will shrink as we go through it, because there'll be less, obviously, weeks left for those chop downs to happen. So if you are interested, let us know. You can let me know on Twitter at Overtime Ireland, or you can reach out at rotovizradio@gmail.com. This has been a Guillotine League. Hopefully we survived the chop, but we are now right on the doorstep of the NFL season. As you're listening to this, it's probably just before Thursday Night Football. Enjoy Thursday Night Football. Obviously, I'll be hoping the Packers get the win then on Friday down in Brazil, which is another interesting element of week 1 for some of these teams, is the travel. But enjoy week 1. I mentioned we're due to have a baby over the next week, so schedule could flip at any moment. But until we are back, my name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out his work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.